Boldwood presents Trying Times for the Mill Girls, written by Chrissie Walsh and read by Charlie Sanderson. Chapter 1. Almondbury, Huddersfield, in the West Riding, 1900. A mad March wind tugged at the window frames in the upstairs room at Farview House, and the Virginia creeper scrabbled its fingers against the leaded glass panes. Inside the darkened room in the large double bed, Verity Hardcastle moved restlessly as she slept. In armchairs either side of the hearth, Ada Brooke and Clara Medley sat drinking tea and waiting for their mistress to give birth. The two elderly women knew Verity well. Clara had been housekeeper in Farview House for more years than she could count, and had cared for the young Verity in the absence of her mother, and Ada had nursed Verity's father after he had suffered a stroke, which had eventually caused his death. Now they talked in low voices about a new life in the house, one they expected to arrive before dawn. Verity had had her first contraction in the late afternoon, squealing as the pain seared through her body, then panting with relief as it subsided. More had followed in the early evening, but since then she had experienced nothing but a few twinges, and now, close on midnight, her nurse and her housekeeper had little to do but hold whispered conversation as they kept watch. Over in the large bed with high brass and iron ends, the bed in which she herself had been born, Verity was lying on her side, her long chestnut hair scribbling the white pillows against which her flushed cheek was pressed. In her tangled dreams, her father was towering over her, his lips wet with spittle as he berated her for being a big ugly lump, a gawky girl who no man would ever want to marry. How many times had she heard those words? She opened her mouth to deny them, and half sleeping and half awake, with the cruel taunt still hurting, she let out a loud groan as an agonizing pain tore her into wakefulness. The sheer force of it rolled her over onto her back, her long frame, overly tall for a woman, stretched out on the bed as the grinding torture racked her body. Ada and Clara sprang to their feet and hurried to stand at either side of the bed. There, said Clara, smoothing her hand over Verity's fevered brow. It's the bairn, just letting you know it's ready to come. Lift your knees and wait for the next contraction, then push when I tell you, Ada said, pulling up the sheets and peering under them. When she came upright, she shook her head. Nothing to see as yet, she murmured to Clara, as Verity flopped back on the mattress. Clara dipped a cloth into a bowl, then mopped her mistress's face. Verity's eyes were closed and she lay perfectly still, readying herself for the next contraction. Several minutes ticked by without any further action, and Verity appeared to be dozing. First timers always take longer. Ada spoke with the authority of years of experience as a nurse and midwife. Aye, that's a fact, but I've never seen a woman as big with child as Miss Verity is, Clara whispered. I reckon there's a big lad in there. Ada gazed down at her patient. She didn't doubt her own ability as a midwife. She'd delivered hundreds of babies, but suddenly she felt uneasy. Should they send for the doctor? Aye, she is unusually big, but then she's a big lass, and Oliver's a strapping fellow. The strapping fellow in question was downstairs, pacing the drawing-room floor and smoking one cigarette after another. He was about to become a family man, a man who had never contemplated marriage until he had fallen head over heels in love with Verity Lockwood. Oliver Hardcastle had been the manager of Jebediah Lockwood's failing worsted mill when first he met Jeb's daughter. Now he was her husband, and soon to be the father of the child she was struggling to deliver. He smiled wryly as he remembered the morning some 3 years ago when Verity had arrived at Lockwood Mill, and how he had dismissed her interest in saving the failing business as frivolous. Then, other than being Jeb Lockwood's daughter, She had no connection with the mill, and as far as he knew, her childhood years had been spent at boarding school and afterwards living with her aunt in Leeds until she came of age. However, he had soon realised her sincerity and her genuine desire to save the mill from bankruptcy and the jobs of almost 100 employees. Impressed by her determination, he had schemed along with her as to how they might do just that. Between them, they had hatched various plans behind Verity's father's back, and whilst he spent his days and nights drinking and gambling in the inns in Huddersfield, Verity and Oliver had worked together to combat Jeb's profligacy and rescue Lockwood Mill. When Jeb suffered a stroke caused by a lifetime of carousing, Verity not only nursed him, but continued to work at the mill. And when her father had eventually died, she became heiress of the small but thriving worsted mill in Aspley Basin. Memories of that time flooded Oliver's mind, and tired of pacing, he came to a stop in front of the hearth and watched the slow progress of the minute hand on the clock on the mantelpiece, as he recalled how, during their first year together, he had taught Verity everything he knew about running a mill and making cloth, and how in the long hours they had spent in each other's company, they had turned the business round. And not only that, he had fallen in love with her, and any misgivings he'd had about falling for his boss had flown out of the window when he had found that love reciprocated. By mutual agreement, they had kept their romance secret, and their courtship, if it could be termed as such, had been hidden from all who knew them. Oliver not wanting to be seen as a bounder, marrying the mill mistress for monetary gain and acceptance into the upper classes, and Verity conscious that the more snobbish mill owners, and particularly their wives, would be aghast at her courting her mill manager. As the mill began to prosper, Verity, having been born into the upper echelons of the manufacturing elite in the Colne Valley, had been readily accepted into its social circle. She had been thrilled by the invitations to attend the mill owners' grand houses, and thinking it was good for business, she had immersed herself in their company. Now, as Oliver crossed the room to pour himself a glass of whiskey, he remembered, rather bitterly, that he had never been included. A mill manager was working class. A rueful smile twitched the corners of his mouth as, sipping his whiskey, he mused on how Verity's introduction into the mill-owning fraternity had gone to her head and almost destroyed their relationship. She had embarked on a whirlwind of parties, unaware that some of the manufacturers were making a game of her. It was unusual for a woman to run a mill, and whilst she had learned her trade well under Oliver's guidance and could hold her own when discussing mill business, her lack of experience in society and her naivety had allowed the unscrupulous Clarence Hargreaves to take advantage of her. Clarence Hargreaves. The name still rankled. Oliver slugged his drink, then refilled his glass before plumping down on the couch. As he lit yet another cigarette and anxiously listened for noises from above, he recalled how he had warned Verity that Hargreaves had wanted her not for herself, but to save his own floundering mill from closure. That memory brought to mind an incident that had occurred shortly before they had planned to announce their engagement, Christmas, 1897. Verity had suggested that come the new year, the mill workers who started work at 6 a.m. should start an hour later for the same pay. Oliver had angrily told her they couldn't afford to do that, and they had quarrelled. She had stormed off to a Christmas party in the George Hotel, and Oliver, regretting his anger, had gone after her, only to catch her in the arms of Clarence Hargreaves. Oliver's lips twisted into a snarl as he replayed the scene. He had already been told by a fellow mill manager that Hargreaves was pursuing Verity to get his hands on her mill and rescue his own that was in dire straits. Oliver had tried to shrug off the gossip, but the seeds of doubt had been sown. Did the mill mistress truly love him? Or was he, as his mother had warned, simply being used? On the day he dashed into the George Hotel, the rumours that Verity and Clarence were romantically involved had suddenly become reality. Oliver had seen red. He wasn't by nature a violent man, but he had thoroughly enjoyed the sound of Clarence's nose crunching under the weight of his fist and the sight of blood staining his fancy shirt. That recollection brought a smile to Oliver's face, and as he emptied his glass, he reflected on how stupidly he had behaved in the aftermath. Believing she had made a fool of him, he had left the mill and gone to Cumbria without giving Verity the opportunity to explain that she detested Clarence and that he had been kissing her against her will. Fortunately for him, Verity's friend, Dolly Armitage, chanced to meet Oliver's mother and tell her the truth of the situation. Evelyn Hardcastle had then passed on the information to her son. He had hot-footed it back to Huddersfield just in the nick of time to save the mill from being burned to the ground. Had it not been for Dolly, he might still have been nursing his pride in Cumbria, Oliver told himself, as he got to his feet and resumed his pacing. Later, they had learned that Hargreaves had sought revenge when Verity had spurned him, and he had paid a disgruntled overseer whom Verity had sacked for sexually abusing the young weavers to set fire to her mill. Oliver's heartbeat quickened as he pictured the blazing wool shed and Verity enveloped in flames. He'd saved her then, but by leaving for Cumbria without giving her a chance to explain that Clarence meant nothing to her, he had shattered her belief in him. Now, shaking his head to dispel the memory of how close he had come to losing her, he crossed the room and opened the door, listening for sounds from above, considering himself to be a most fortunate man to have restored her faith in him. Theirs was a true marriage of minds, and as Oliver waited to become a father, he thanked God for their happiness, asking him to speed the birth of their child and release his beloved Verity from the pain she was now enduring. Up in the bedroom, when night was at its thinnest, Verity bit down on her bottom lip as another contraction racked her sweat-soaked body. They were coming regularly now, and she was doing her utmost to comply with Ada's instructions. "Keep breathing like I told," Ada said. "And you, Clara, supported by the shoulders." Verity took a deep breath. Her body heaved again and she let out an agonising wail that ended in a full-blown scream. "Push now, push!" Ada cried, as a head covered in dark hair appeared and was swiftly followed by the body of a squirming boy-child with a healthy pair of lungs. Tying, then snipping the umbilical cord, she handed the baby to Clara. "T' master'll be pleased it's a boy," said Clara as she cleaned the baby, ready to place him in his mother's arms. Verity fell back against the pillows, gasping for breath and her eyes wild. Ada peered at the blood-stained mess between Verity's legs. Coming upright, she began smoothing her hands over Verity's swollen belly. Something wasn't right. Verity's womb undulated under Ada's touch. Ada drew a sharp breath, her practiced palms and finger gently probing and her mouth twisting with fear. Clara leaned into the bed to hand the swaddled baby to his mother. "Wait, not yet, Clara, hold on." Ada's voice had risen an octave. "There's another one in there." Panic surged. "Get Oliver to fetch Dr. Braithwaite. Tell him it's urgent." Clara dithered with the child still in her arms. "Put him in the crib," Ada snapped. And when Clara did as she was told, Ada said, "He'll be fine." Whereas her fear for the life of the unborn child and its mother mounting, she shooed the housekeeper out of the room. Clearly confused, Clara tottered down the stairs as fast as her aged legs would carry her. Without knocking, she burst into the drawing room. Oliver hurried towards her, an expectant smile on his face. "Ada says, get Dr. Braithwaite. It's urgent." Clara squawked, collapsing against the door jamb, then clinging to it for dear life. "Another baby, that's what Ada had said." But before she could tell him, Oliver had pushed past her and, pale and distraught, he was dashing to the rear of the house. The pony and trap had been left ready in case of an emergency, one which he had prayed wouldn't arise. Springing into the driver's seat, he urged the little grey mare out of the stable yard and down Farview Hill. The moon was hidden behind banks of thick grey cloud, and the road in front of him black as pitch. The howling wind tore at his hair and whipped the branches of the trees as he descended the steep incline into the heart of the village where, heedless of waking its sleeping inhabitants, he hammered on the doctor's door. Meanwhile, as Oliver and the bleary-eyed doctor sped back to Fairview House, Ada was doing her utmost to ease Verity's distress. Ada knew from experience that a second child inside the womb had a better chance of survival if the mother rested between deliveries. At the same time as praying that the baby would change its position and that her patient wouldn't hemorrhage, she chastised herself for not realizing that Verity had been carrying twins. "I should have known by the size of her," she moaned. Verity's eyes flitted from Ada to Clara, who, having come back to the bedroom, was tending to the boy in the crib. "What's happening?" she whispered. "You've got a beautiful, healthy son, lass, but it's not over yet. So breathe slowly and don't push no matter how much you want to," Ada told her through gritted teeth. "A son? I have a son." Verity struggled to comprehend what she had heard and fought to still the movements inside her. "Breathe slowly. Don't push. Breathe slow." Verity lay still and breathed slowly, her pale lips fluttering. The sheets that had been smooth and white were rocked and stained, the room reeking with the smell of childbirth. The minutes ticked by. Ada glanced anxiously at the clock, then back to Verity. Was she and the unborn child losing the will to live? And where was the blaster doctor? Jeremy Braithwaite was hurrying up the stairs 2 at a time, with Oliver at his heels. "Better you stay out here, old chap," Jeremy said, ducking into the bedroom, then closing the door in Oliver's face. The young doctor was new to the village, and as he listened carefully to Ada, he thanked God that he had made a point of studying labour, parturition and delivery. His own mother had died giving birth to his younger brother when Jeremy was a boy. Placing his hands on Verity's abdomen, he began his examination. The boy in the crib cried lustily, and with Ada's guidance, Clara fed him drops of sugar water. His crying ceased as his lips sucked on her little finger. Now, the only sounds in the room were the doctor's urgent instructions to Ada and their patient's anxious cries. 25 stressful minutes later, minutes in which Verity had writhed and grunted, Jeremy eased the tiny mite into the world. Placing his mouth over the child's nose and mouth, he cleared its airways, then, dangling it by its feet, he gave its rump a gentle slap. With a triumphant smile, he gave the baby to Ada, its faint mewling cries growing louder as she cradled the tiny child against her shoulder and gently rubbed its back. Then he turned his attention back to its mother. Verity felt a pair of gentle hands touching the parts of her body that had only been touched by herself or Oliver, but she made no objection. The dreadful tearing pains had eased, and as her mind cleared, Jeremy Braithwaite's pleasant face came into focus. She managed a tremulous little smile, and he returned it with an encouraging grin. Then, assured that everything was in order, he stood back, rubbing his hands clean and smiling broadly at Ada, then Clara, acknowledging the parts they had played, before he turned back to his patient. "Well done," Jeremy congratulated Verity. "You have a son and a daughter." "2 babies." The new mother gazed in confused awe at the large bundle in Clara's arms, and then at the fragile little scrap that Ada was holding. "Twins! I gave birth to twins." "That you did, lovey, and a grand job you made of it," said Clara, placing the boy in the crook of Verity's right arm. And as Ada took the little girl into Verity's left side, she said, "She's small, but she's perfectly healthy." Spellbound, Verity lay in a dreamlike state, the feel of her children's warm little bodies filling her heart with a love so overwhelming that she began to cry. Recognizing them as tears of joy, Jeremy, Ada and Clara exchanged pleased glances. Ada began to hastily clear away the afterbirths, bundling them in newspapers and handing them to Clara to dispose of on the blazing fire. Then, as the midwife gently sponged between her patient's thighs, the fog that clouded Verity's brain slowly dissipated, bringing her surroundings sharply into focus. She saw the doctor packing his bag, and Clara's bent back as she stoked something on the fire and felt the soothing swab of Ada's hand. But something was wrong. Someone was missing. "Oliver! Where is Oliver?" At Verity's anxious cry, Ada left off sponging and pulled Verity's nightdress down over her legs. Clara gave the bundle of papers on the fire a final prod, and the doctor hurried over to the door, his smile wide. Oliver was pacing the landing when Jeremy stepped out to fetch him. "Is it over?" he gasped. "Is Verity all right? Is the child born?" Jeremy grinned. "Your wife and your babies are grand." "Babies?" Oliver stared, nonplussed. "Aye, a bruiser of a boy and a dainty little girl." Oliver's jaw dropped and his eyes widened in wonder. He had been thrice blessed. Not only did he have a beautiful, marvellous wife, he now had a son and a daughter. His heart swelled, and his eyes glowed with love and anticipation as he strode into the bedroom. Chapter 2. "What shall we call them?" Oliver asked Verity, his chest puffed with manly pride at having fathered two such beautiful specimens of humanity. A big, healthy, handsome boy and a little pretty girl. His wife, having given considerable thought to the naming of her son, turned her luminous dove-grey eyes on him, ready, in part, to answer her husband's question. The proud parents were in the nursery at Farview House, a splendidly appointed room with its 2 deep armchairs and 2 finely crafted cribs, a second one having been hastily ordered from Best's furniture shop on Queen Street. Each one bore the emblem of a Yorkshire rose that was the craftsman's signature, as did the drawers and cupboards that were filled with soft white nappies and sheets. Hanging in the wardrobe were the long white baby gowns trimmed with lace and ribbon that Verity had purchased from Rushworth's Bazaar during her pregnancy, a task that had given her the greatest pleasure. Now, as her husband cradled their daughter and Verity nursed their son, she answered him with alacrity. "I want to call him Blaise, after Merlin's tutor in the Arthurian legends." Oliver laughed and asked, "Why not just Arthur?" "Because Blaise was one of the keepers of the Holy Grail, a martyr, and a magically adept swordsman," Verity replied, her smile enigmatic. Oliver shook his head in bemusement. "Well, then Blaise it is," he said, wondering what on earth anyone else would make of such a name. "And what about this delightful, sweet little creature?" he asked, caressing his daughter's creamy cheek, then gently coiling a wisp of her red gold hair round his finger. "I'll let you choose." Silence fell as Oliver pursed his lips and furrowed his brow. Then, his countenance brightening, he said, "I'd like to call her Briony." Verity brooked no opposition to Briony, but she was curious as to why he had chosen it. "I read somewhere that it means to climb to the highest heights as it blooms," he said. "It's a thing of nature, and the colour of her hair sums up the beauty of the landscape in which we live. Those glorious autumn days when the moors turn russet and gold." "Poetry to my ears, my darling," Verity laughed, then said, "How blessed we are." And so, Blaise and Briony Hardcastle were duly christened in All Hallows Church, the vicar just one of the many in the congregation who were puzzled, amused, or mildly shocked at Verity and Oliver's choice of such outlandish names. "I suppose Albert and Susan weren't good enough for the likes of them," one old dear was heard to comment as they left the church. "Well, they'd not want to call the lad Jebediah in case it turns out like his grandfather, that drunken reprobate." Her companion's reply was laden with sarcasm. The other mill hands in hearing distance sniggered. Verity delighted in being a mother to her 2 babies, even though she herself had no memory of ever having been mothered. Her own mother, Layla, had always been too ill to devote the time and attention that Verity now gave to her own offspring. They, in turn, responded to her loving care by growing into healthy bundles of joy. However, before long, it was plain for all to see that although the brother and sister had shared the same womb, they had acquired very different personalities. The Hardcastle's diminutive daughter was placid and obedient. She slept for long hours, and at feeding time she sucked delicately at her mother's breast, then fell asleep again. Her sweet, gentle nature endeared her not only to her father, but also to Clara Medley and Briony's extended family, her grandmother, Evelyn Hardcastle, and her aunts, Rose and Maud. And as Verity nursed Briony, it evoked a tender feeling of love bordering on gratitude, quite unlike that she felt for Blaise, who was awake at all hours, roaring and wriggling, his chubby fists pummeling at Verity's breast as his hungry lips ravaged her nipples. Strangely enough, this assault on her body stirred Verity into feeling a fiercely passionate love for her son, something altogether different from that she felt for her daughter. Whenever she gazed into his dark, restless eyes and at his firm chin and Roman nose, so like his father's, her heart swelled, and her breath caught in her throat at the realization that she, Verity Hardcastle, née Lockwood, an ugly gawk of a girl as her father had often described her, was the wellspring that had given life to such a magnificent child. Oliver, quick to spot where Verity's adoration was focused, centred his attention on his delicate little girl. In the nursery, always his first port of call when he arrived home from the mill, he would cradle Briony in his strong arms and lose himself in her dove-grey eyes and rosebud mouth. Meanwhile, his wife dandled Blaise on her knee in an attempt to pacify him as he grabbed at her hair and pawed at her face, bawling and clinging to her when she tried to put him down. In unwanted moments, Oliver found himself thinking of a limpet, or, more uncalled for, a leech, as Blaise demanded more and more of his mother's devotion. By the time the twins were 5 months old, their different temperaments were often the subject of conversations held by family and friends. Also remarked on was the attention their mother gave to one child and not the other. And so, on a beautiful autumn day just before noon, when Ada Brooke made one of her regular visits to Farview House to check on the twins' progress and offer Verity some much-needed advice, she didn't look particularly happy. In the kitchen, taking off her gloves and accepting the cup of tea Clara offered, her tone of voice held more than a hint of concern as she asked, "And how are things today?" Clara pulled a face as she poured boiling water over the leaves in the pot. "Same as usual," she said, exasperation colouring her words. "And judging by the bags under Madam's eyes, she was up again most of the night with that rapscallion of a son of hers." Ada heaved a sigh, then said, "She can't go on like this. It's detrimental to her and the children. But will she listen?" "No." The two women continued to air their concerns about Verity, Blaise and Briony as they sipped their tea. "She's a lovely little thing and no bother at all," Clara said, smiling fondly as they commented on Briony's progress. "But," her lip curled, "he's turning out to be a right handful. What with his tantrums and bawling his head off as she puts him down, he keeps that poor lass on her toes day and night." "And she submits to his every whim," Ada said with a despairing shake of her head. "Even though I've told her time and again that the more attention she pays him, the more he will demand. I've seen it often enough. There isn't a baby anywhere that's not cute enough to know how to manipulate its mother, and Blaise is a master of exploitation, for all he's not yet 6 months old." Ada set down her empty cup and stood. "I'll go up and see how things stand today. Try and talk some sense into her, but I don't expect she'll listen." Clara lifted a pile of clean nappies from the end of the table. "I'll take these up and ask her what she'd like for lunch. Not that she'll get chance to eat in peace," Ada tutted. "I have told her she mustn't neglect herself, that she needs to eat plenty whilst ever she's breastfeeding. But I noticed on my last visit that she's looking rather gaunt." "And no wonder," Clara replied as they made their way up the basement stairs into the hallway, then climbed the next flight up to the nursery. They heard the cacophony long before they reached it. When the two women entered, they exchanged meaningful glances. Verity was sitting on a chair by the window, the buttons on her loose wrapper undone, and one side of her nursing corsets open to reveal her breast. Shadows beneath her eyes resembled overripe plums, and her unwashed hair was scraped back unbecomingly. But the look on her weary face was one of patient admiration as, seeming oblivious to Briony's hungry little whimpers, she opened the other side of her corset and attached Blaise to her nipple. He stopped writhing and screaming and began to guzzle. "Give him to me," said Ada, marching over to the window and abruptly detaching the cantankerous boy. "Your daughter needs feeding, so do that whilst I settle this lad." Verity, taken aback by Ada's brisk removal of Blaise, cried out, "But he hasn't had his fill. He's hardly likely to starve." Ada retorted as she hefted the chubby, big-boned baby up to her shoulder. Depositing him in his crib, she lifted his sister. Blaise wailed all the louder, his eyes fixed on his mother as she reluctantly allowed Ada to place Briony in her arms. The baby girl attached her rosebud mouth to Verity's breast. Clara looked on approvingly. She's an angel as that one, she cooed, as Briony placidly sucked, her tiny hands tucked under her chin. Although Verity cradled her daughter and stroked her downy head lovingly, her eyes strayed to Blaise in his crib. Ada went and lifted him to her shoulder again. When Briony's lips slackened and her eyes drooped, Verity handed her to Clara. Put her down to rest, she said, and looking to where Blaise was pummeling Ada's cheeks with his fists, Verity commanded, Give him back to me, he's still hungry. Ada did as she was asked, and Blaise clamped his greedy mouth on Verity's breast. Verity winced as he pulled on her nipple, but she bore the pain silently until Blaise released his hold. He burped loudly, and with his head lolled against Verity's bosom, he dozed. Ada stooped to take him from his mother's arms, but Verity stopped her with a look. Ada came upright, her expression grim. Mrs. Hardcastle, I've said it before and I'll say it again. You're not doing yourself or your son any favours. On Sunday afternoon in August, Oliver and Verity set out to pay one of their regular visits to his mother's house, Verity proudly pushing the pram through the village as they made their way to Evelyn Hardcastle's home at the foot of Almondbury Bank. Oliver, equally proud, strolled along by Verity's side, every now and then tipping his hat to the ladies and shaking the hands of the men who stopped to admire the babies and the large gleaming silver cross pram in which they were propped on cushions, one at either end. The sun shone down on the tendrils of Briony's red-gold hair that peeped from under her lacy bonnet, the ladies exclaiming she was a picture. It also shone on Blaise's angry red cheeks and his sullen mouth, as, squirming and roaring, he tried to free himself from the blanket that restrained his movements. The admirers tended to look away in embarrassment, as did Oliver, but Verity happily related her children's progress in answer to their questions. The untended path across Dog Kennel Bank was a riot of colour, with dandelions, scarlet pimpernel, yellow archangel, red sorrel, purple vetch, and feathery green fescue grasses. As Verity breathed in their sweet, fresh scents, she felt glad to be alive, and her happiness stayed with her until shortly after they arrived at their destination. Oliver's mother had, as usual, laid on a spread of egg and onion sandwiches and homemade sponge cake, but Verity was so busy coping with Blaise that her plate was barely touched. When the time came for them to leave, Evelyn couldn't resist saying, You can bring Briony any time you like and leave her with us. She's such a pleasure to have about the place. But as for that one, she waggled an accusing finger at Blaise. None of my children ever behaved so badly. Verity, who had always been of the opinion that her mother-in-law objected to Oliver marrying his boss, as she had then been, seethed at the remark, then shrugged it off as just another of Evelyn's jibes meant to let Verity know that she wasn't the sort of woman she would have chosen for him. And Rose, his older sister, hadn't helped by twittering how sweet Briony was, not unlike her friend Lucy Whittaker's baby, who was an absolute dream. Lucy, having failed to capture Oliver's heart, had married a bank clerk, and just as cleverly produced a very adorable son, not in the least like yours, Rose had added spitefully. Determined not to let them see how hurt she was, Verity raged inwardly, but when, as they made their way home, Oliver suggested that Blaise took after Rose, Verity strongly objected. It was nothing like Rose. She was a shrewish spinster with a vindictive nature. Hadn't she tried to come between them in the early days of their courtship by telling Verity that he already was as good as engaged to Lucy Whittaker? And I hope you aren't suggesting that Briony takes after Maud, she said tartly. Because his youngest sister was what Oliver's mother inferred to as light-headed, Maud being a simple woman with a vacant expression in her eyes. Maud can't help the way she is, he snapped. She was born damaged. Verity had the grace to look ashamed. But throughout the following months, as summer faded into autumn and Christmas drew near, she remained blind to her rip-roaring son's willfulness and turned a deaf ear to the advice that Oliver, Clara and Ada frequently gave. "You're spoiling him. He has to learn to know his limits. He's deliberately trying your patience to see just how far he can go. You'll live to rue the day." Chapter 3. Almondbury, Huddersfield, in the West Riding, January 1901. "Queen Victoria dead! Read all about it!" The newsboy's cry rang out as Verity and Oliver Hardcastle's trap slowed to a stop at the junction of the Somerset and Wakefield roads. Verity's gloved hand shot to her mouth. "Oh my goodness! Buy a newspaper, Oliver!" she cried, her voice rising above the noise of passing carts and wagons, and the anticipation and excitement she'd felt on the journey from Farview House fading fast. This was to be her first full working day at the mill since the birth of Blaise and Briony, and she had been so looking forward to it that now she felt somewhat cheated. For the past 10 months, she had devoted her time to nursing her babies, delighting in giving them the loving care that she herself had been denied. Although Verity had only vague memories of her own mother, she knew that Layla had been too sickly to attend to her, and that it was Clara who had cared for her before Jeb sent her to boarding school. Determined that her own children would never know such deprivation, she had gladly stayed at home. But just lately, the lure of the mill had been calling to her with each passing day. And listening to Oliver's second-hand news as he related all the goings-on in the mill about the business or the latest gossip from the girls wasn't the same as being there. The mill was part of her heart, and she felt as though she was missing out. Rather reluctantly, for she had found it hard to leave Blaise even for a few hours, she had employed a nanny to help care for them and satisfy her own needs. Mary Shuttleworth was a lovely, efficient young woman. The twins had taken to her like ducks to water, and Verity, relieved to escape the confines of the nursery, had no qualms today about leaving them in Mary's care for the day. Oliver beckoned to the newsboy, tossed him a coin, then handed the copy of the Yorkshire Post to his wife. As she scanned the headlines, he flicked the pony's reins, and they joined the stream of traffic heading towards Aspley Basin. "Yesterday evening at 6:30 on Tuesday, the 22nd of January, our beloved Queen Victoria died peacefully at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, surrounded by her family," Verity read out loud as Oliver drove the trap along the wharf to the mill. Verity continued reading until they reached the mill gates, 12 feet high and crafted in heavy wrought iron. The arch above them spelled out Lockwood Mill. Her heart swelled with pride. The gatekeeper swung the gates wide, then saluted the mill mistress. Verity smiled and called out, "Good morning, Joe." "Thou's heard the news, then?" Joe asked, as Oliver steered the trap into the cobbled mill yard and brought it to a halt. "We have, Joe. A sad day," said Oliver, jumping down and handing the reins to Joe before helping Verity alight. It was just past 9 o'clock. The January morning bright but chilly, and a coating of frost lingering on the cobbles as they made their way to the mill office. "Do you think we should close the mill today out of respect?" Verity asked Oliver as she slipped off her cloak and hung it on the hook in the office wall. "No need for that. We don't want to fall behind with our orders. We'll close the day of the funeral." He smiled to lessen the impact of his curt response, but it was his responsibility to curb Verity's enthusiasm for doing the right thing, as she saw it. Business was business, and she often let her heart rule her head. "We'll fly the Union Jack at half-mast. That will do." Verity nodded, somewhat appeased. 4 years ago, when she had first taken over her father's business, she would have argued that it was her mill, and she should be the one to make decisions. However, she had learned a lot since then about manufacturing fine worsted cloth, most of it under Oliver's guidance. And now that they were not only husband and wife but business partners, she stifled her impetuosity and let Oliver have his way. "It's the end of an era, one that's seen many changes and much of them for the better," Oliver remarked as he lifted a bundle of yarns. He began sorting through them, and Verity opened a ledger to check on the progress of their orders as they continued commenting on how Victoria's reign had seen the British Empire grow to become the first global industrial power, producing much of the world's coal, iron, steel, and textiles. Our industry has improved by leaps and bounds under her rule, said Oliver. At one time, we'd never have dreamed of exporting our cloth to countries thousands of miles away. Now we do it regularly. Yes, she was the figurehead who saw us through some extraordinary times. Verity began ticking them off on her fingers. The Crimean War, the abolition of slavery, the Great Exhibition at Crystal Palace, and the wonderful advances in the arts and sciences. A great deal of change in our lifetimes, Oliver. And we can expect much more now that we have a new monarch, he replied, picking up the yarns he'd selected, then striding to the office door. I'm off to the dye house. After he had gone, Verity leaned back in her chair and gazed up at the office ceiling through half-closed eyes, her thoughts drifting. She'd experienced plenty of changes in her own lifetime, some of them unbelievably joyful and some heartbreakingly cruel. Her life hadn't always been as sweet as it was now. She had been Jeb and Layla Lockwood's only surviving child. 2 of her 3 brothers stillborn, and the 3rd dead within a year of his birth. Verity had grown up in the sure and certain knowledge that Jeb, a callous and cruel reprobate, had never forgiven her for being a girl, and an ugly one at that, as he had so often told her. Great big gawky girl. The words still stung, and she flinched as she recalled her father's harsh, guttural voice mocking her. Oh, how she had longed to have a mother to run to then, one who would comfort and protect her from Jeb's nasty jibes and his drunken wrath. But she had barely known her mother. Layla, taking her doctor's advice, had spent all but 3 months of the year living in Cornwall in the hope that it would cure her tattered lungs, the air being much cleaner there than the smoke-laden, soot-filled clouds that hung over the industrial town that was Huddersfield. Unfortunately, it hadn't, and now, as a grown woman, Verity presumed that her mother's absence had been perhaps more to escape her husband's cruelty than it was to improve her health. Poor Layla, she thought. Did she love me? And would she have packed me off to boarding school in Headingley, more than 20 miles away from home? Somehow, Verity thought not. Boarding school. Her memory of it was not unkind, but she had been lonely, particularly at holiday times, when the other girls had gone home and she had been left with only the Mrs. Dowling for company. But even that had been preferable to what came afterwards, when, within days of her mother's death, Jeb had sent her to live with his sister, Martha, and her unwelcoming husband, Joseph Boothroyd. From the start, her Uncle Joseph had made it quite plain he didn't want her in his home. He'd complained bitterly about what he called her childish clutter and avoided being in the same room as her whenever possible. What Verity would never know was that her childless aunt's husband had a predilection for young girls, and whilst he felt no compunction about dallying with underage village girls, he drew the line at doing so in his house. Verity's presence too tempting, he had demanded that Martha get rid of her, and Aunt Martha had reluctantly asked Jeb to take her away. Jeb, infuriated by his sister's request, had taken his daughter back to Farview House, and after 2 miserable weeks in which he had neglected her or cruelly chastised her, he had sent her to live with Layla's sister in Leeds. At 14 years of age, Verity had felt like a parcel that nobody wanted to receive. Aunt Flora had taken her in, rather unwillingly, and her 3 cousins, silly girls who made fun of her bookishness and her height and dowdy appearance, had made her life a misery. Throughout her unhappy childhood and teenage years, Verity had felt that she had nowhere she could call home. I was a disappointment to everyone, she thought, shifting uneasily in the hard office chair and grimacing as she recalled that by the time she was 21, Aunt Flora had tired of trying to find her a suitable husband. Not that I was looking for one, she reflected. And having no money of her own and nowhere else to go, she had returned to Farview House. She gave an involuntary shudder at the memory of how unwelcoming her father had been, and that she had felt like a stranger in the house. Had it not been for Martha, who lived close by, life would have been unbearable. If Aunt Martha hadn't warned me that my father was in danger of losing his mill and his home, I might not have stayed, she thought, her heart fluttering at the idea. If I hadn't, I would never have met Oliver. A gentle smile curved her lips. Darling Oliver. What a wonderful man he was. He had worked at Lockwood Mill since leaving school and had risen to the position of mill manager. For his own sake and that of all the workers employed in the mill, he had struggled against the odds to keep the mill solvent. And he'd thought I was a foolish upper-class girl interfering in the business on a passing whim, she mused, her smile widening as she recollected what Aunt Martha had told her. Take matters into your own hands, Verity. It's up to you to save the mill. And saving the mill was my epiphany. Dreamily, she dwelt on how she had not only fallen in love with the mill and rescued it from the brink of bankruptcy, she had fallen head over heels in love with its manager. Then, much to the surprise and a certain amount of disdain from the other mill owners in the cloth-making heart of the woolen industry that was Huddersfield, she had married him. Her heart gave a little jolt as she recalled how near she had come to not marrying Oliver. That thought brought to mind the detestable Clarence Hargreaves. He had wormed his way into her company, and Verity had spurned his advances at every turn, but Oliver hadn't known that. When he'd witnessed Clarence foisting a kiss on her at a Christmas party in the George Hotel, he had believed she was romantically involved with him. After delivering a blow to Clarence's nose, Oliver had left without giving her a chance to explain. Oliver's sudden disappearance and the struggle to keep the mill running without him had left Verity devastated. That he hadn't trusted her enough to let her tell him that Clarence had forced himself on her had been beyond bearing. She'd pined for him constantly, but her faith in him had been badly shaken, and it had taken a great deal of persuasion on Oliver's part to restore her trust. What a fool I was then. I don't know how I could have thought so badly of him when all the time I knew I could not live without him. She stretched lazily, enjoying the memory of making up with him. She, who had once believed that no man would ever marry her, was not only the successful heiress of a thriving business, but the wife of Oliver and the mother of twins. At 25 years of age, Verity considered herself blessed. She was still musing on her good fortune when Oliver bounced back into the office. Daydreaming again, I see, he said, his sharp blue eyes meeting a pair of the softest dove grey, and his wife delivering a sharp rebuke that she was doing nothing of the sort. I was thinking, she told him, smiling up into the handsome face of the man she loved with every fibre of her being. She watched as he stripped off his jacket, exposing his broad chest and strong shoulders under a crisp white shirt. At 6 feet tall, his fine physique and black hair that curled round his ears and in the nape of his neck still caused Verity's heart to flutter as it had done when first they met. Then she had struggled with emotions that she had never before felt, but now, sure in his love for her and hers for him, she no longer felt unattractive and out of place as she had so often done in the past. She got to her feet, her face almost on a level with his, and told him she was going to make her rounds of the mill. Oliver watched Verity go, his eyes filled with admiration. In his opinion, she was beautiful, although some might have disagreed. Her shapely figure was unfashionably tall, and her straight nose, high cheekbones and well-defined chin made her look haughty. But he knew that she was as lovely on the inside as he considered her to be on the outside. She had given everything she possessed to save Lockwood Mill from dissolution, not for her own sake, but for the well-being of the workforce and their livelihoods. To Oliver, she was the most adorable woman in the whole world. Verity strolled across the cobbled mill yard towards the weaving shed. Doing her rounds of the mill was one of her pleasures, one that she had undertaken every day when she first became the mill mistress. She attached great importance to getting to know her employees. From the start, she had believed that if she treated them with respect and ensured that their working conditions were safe and their wages fair, they would reciprocate by producing the finest worsted. And she had been proved right. Although her mill was small compared to some in the valley, it now had a good reputation for weaving top-quality cloth, and orders were plentiful. Lingering at the weaving shed door, she recalled that inheriting the mill had not only given her a husband she adored, it had also granted her the wonderful friendship of Dolly Armitage. Dolly had been a weaver at the mill, and the friendship had begun when Verity discovered that Dolly could read, an attribute denied to many of the mill hands who had had little or no schooling. Verity had then had the idea to start reading classes for her workforce and give them the opportunity to better themselves. Oliver had laughed at the notion, and most of the mill hands had shunned the classes in the belief that she was sneering at their ignorance. At first, few had attended, but Verity had remained undeterred. Along with Dolly's enthusiastic assistance, the number of pupils swelled from 5 to 25 in a matter of months. The classes were still running, one evening each week. Those who had learned to read, teaching the newcomers. They never had fewer than 20 pupils eager to learn. After that, whenever Verity had sought to make improvements, she had asked Dolly's advice, and the sisterly bond they had formed remained strong to the present day. Verity, extremely conscious of the hardships that most working-class women endured, had then introduced other ways to improve their lives. The weekly sewing sessions in the canteen were a great success. The more adept needlewomen showing the beginners how to use the 2 treadle machines that Verity had provided and how to make garments from the offcuts of the cloth they wove, the ends of pieces that would have been shredded for rags. The canteen was another of Verity's improvements, for it enabled the workers to eat their breakfasts and lunches in comfort, whereas before they had sat out in the mill yard on dry days or at their machines if the weather was too cold and wet. Lockwood Mill was known throughout the valley for the benefits it offered its workers, and those who were employed there considered themselves lucky. Verity prided herself on knowing the names and backgrounds of all her workers, one that Oliver had fostered in his years as mill manager, and, as she opened the weaving shed door, she realised just how much she had been looking forward to today. The roar of the looms assailed her ears, and the dust motes rising from the woven cloth swirled before her eyes. She paused, breathing in the familiar smell of wool and grease. It was good to be back. At the top of Weaver's Alley, the wide aisle between the rows of looms, she paused to survey the thrashing looms and the women tending them. Fred Garthwaite, the overseer, hurried to greet her. "Good to see thee back, Mrs. Hardcastle," he mouthed, the noise of the looms making it impossible to conduct an ordinary conversation. "Good to be back, Fred, although the pleasure has been somewhat overshadowed by Queen Victoria's death," Verity mouthed back. Lip reading was one of the many things she had had to learn, and now it came easily to her. She asked Fred about the new jacquard patterns they were weaving and the quality of the yarn. He confirmed that everything was fine, and Verity began walking slowly down the alley. As she walked between the looms, friendly smiles and mouthed inquiries were exchanged. "How are the babies?" "Thriving, getting bigger by the day." "Are they good sleepers?" "I never got a minute with mine." "I know what you mean." Verity gave a mock yawn. "Two at one go. Thou must have done some pushing." Amid cheeky comments and gales of laughter, she strolled to the end of the alley, the weavers' sharp eyes meeting Verity's, then darting back to their looms flying shuttles in case a loose end marred the parallel perfection of the cloth they were weaving. At the end of the shed, where the rattle of looms didn't drown ordinary conversation, she found Nellie Armitage hard at work showing the new apprentices how to weave. Nellie was married to Dolly's brother, George, and like Dolly and her husband, Theo, they were friends of Verity and Oliver. Verity paid no heed to the snobbishness that divided the social classes, something that her fellow industrialists frowned on. They showed their disapproval by withholding invitations to their garden parties and soirees, but Verity and Oliver cared not one jot. They knew who their true friends were. "Have you come to see if we're doing the job right, or did you just get fed up of changing nappies?" Nellie joked. "A bit of both, Nellie. I've missed being here." "And how are Blaise and Briony?" Nellie's eyes twinkled with amusement. Both she and Dolly had been surprised by the unusual names Verity had given her children. "They're grand," said Verity. "I've left them in Mary's capable hands for the day." They continued chatting about the twins and the mill for some time before Verity, pleased by all she had seen and heard so far, continued her rounds from the weaving shed to the spinning and the carding rooms, then the balling room and the raw wool shed before finally going to the dye house. George Armitage, the master dyer and the under-manager at the mill, greeted her with a beaming smile. He was showing her a batch of green yarn and asking for her opinion on the shade of it, when the mill hooter blared. "My goodness, 12:30 already," Verity said, and leaving the dyers to have their dinner, she went back to the office, her heart warmed by the welcome she had received at every port of call. "Will we eat in the canteen today?" she asked Oliver. "I'd like to, seeing as it's my first day back." "Then we will," he said, reaching for his jacket and asking, "Did you find everything to your liking on your rounds?" "Indeed I did," she chirped. Then, giving him a condescending smile, she simpered, "You've managed perfectly well in my absence, Mr. Hardcastle." "Impertinent baggage," said Oliver, playfully slapping her rump as they left the office to make their way over to the canteen. Although the country had known for some time that the Queen's health was declining, the newspapers keeping them abreast of her condition, it had come as something of a shock to learn that their monarch had died. And in the canteen, the workers talked of little else. 63 years on the throne, Isaac Holroyd, the head loom tuner, solemnly declared. And a good queen she was. She had more than her fair share of problems to deal with, and she dealt with 'em wisely. He spoke with the authority of his own 60 years, aware that, like himself, the younger mill hands had never known any other monarch. "Aye, being t' Queen's not all it's cracked up to be," Fred Garthwaite opined. "She'd never been the same since Albert died," May Sykes said. "She loved Albert."